Right. Welcome everybody to this session on the future frontiers of value chains. My name is Arantxa González. I'm the Executive Director of the International Trade Center. It's the Joint Trade Development Agency of the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. So this issue of value chains is very close to my heart. We have an excellent panel to kick off this discussion. Let me briefly introduce the panelists. Let me then briefly introduce this session, and then we're going to dive into the topic of what is the shape that value chains are taking in the 21st century. Panel this morning, let me start with Minister Bugwolo Kenewendo. She's seated on the first row. She's the Minister for Investment, Trade and Industry of Botswana. From left to right, Douglas Peterson, CEO of S&P Global, provider of analytics and data to capital and commodity markets. To his right, Bhairavi Jani, Executive Director of SCA Group of Companies, entrepreneur, India, vast experience in logistics and supply chain. To her right, Shien-Ming, who is a professor of manufacturing, University of Michigan. So he's been looking at value chains and dissecting them. This discussion is about asking a fundamental question: are we looking into a new normal in the world of value chains, or are we looking at adjustments over value chains as we have known them in the last 20 years? There are a number of factors that are pulling in different directions. Technology is obviously a big factor. It is it's changing the relocation of tasks between labor and capital. Services are becoming a more prominent part of the manufacturing landscape. Is the invisible part of manufacturing, but they are having a greater share of manufacturing. 50% of value creation in developed countries, 30% of value creation in China comes from services. Third factor that is having a bearing on value chains, the lowering of trade costs, lowering that comes from different angles, from trade agreements, from improvements in transport and logistics, from technology. Fourth dimension that is having an impact on value chains, sustainability. Concerns that manufacturing and value creation has to be compatible with life in this planet. And a new one that has appeared in the landscape more recently, is not a new one, it's part of human history, but it's having a greater impact on manufacturing, on value chains, on value creation today. It's called geopolitics. We're going to look at all these angles with our panelists. And to kick off this discussion, I want to ask Douglas to maybe give us a bit of a sense by looking at facts and figures of value chains.
Good morning. Thank you, Arantxa. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. And as you know, S&P Global, we're in the data and analytics businesses. You might say, why are you here to talk about trade and manufacturing and trade flows? Increasingly, the financial services sector is getting more and more involved in understanding the risk and the capital of trade flows. And last year, our company, S&P Global, purchased a company called Panjiva that specializes in analyzing trade flows in the global supply chain. And I'm going to use some of their data to explain what we see and just provide a broad picture of trade. Now, we asked the question, is trade global or is it local? And I think many of us will remember in the 70s and 80s when we were studying economics that there was this theory of import substitution. And we're going to see that import substitution did not ever pan out when we look at these statistics. So let's start with a slide that shows you a very simple picture. This is showing you how does the value chain, how does the supply chain actually, how does it actually grow? This is a ratio of trade growth to GDP growth. And very simply, if the number is greater than 1, that means that trade is growing faster than the GDP of the majority of countries. The one year you see that this actually popped up in 1990, in 1990-1999 period, This is when there was almost like a golden period of the unleashing of trade from the WTO, from, if you remember, containerization. This is the period of time when containers became standardized and ports around the world started standardizing shipping. This was also NAFTA. There were many factors which led to this incredible boom. But we've settled back into a period where trade is over 1.5%. It grows faster than underlying economies. And it's very difficult with looking at slides like this to argue that there's something wrong with trade. Trade is one of the fastest areas that economies can grow in. But the components are different, and this is what Arantxa just started off with, is how much trade is now shifting back to being local because of different supply and different manufacturing techniques. We have a question as to which countries are more dependent on trade. This slide is a time series. It goes back and forth between green being less dependent, red being more dependent. We should have made this a little bit more subtle between blues and yellows and greens, but this is just a very simple way to show that overall in this time period, economies are becoming more and more dependent on trade. Why would some economies like Japan, the United States, Brazil, some of the other countries end up at green? It might be they're just slightly over the chart. But on the other hand, some of these countries also have very large service economies. And remember, this is a percentage of trade to the total GDP. And you have economies in Southeast Asia in particular that the economy itself is still very dependent on trade. It's a larger portion of the economy, manufacturing trade, than it might be in a country like the United States where services is such a huge portion of the economy. So conclusion from this chart. Over time, you can see that the economy is becoming more interconnected. If you take the prior chart in place, which showing that trade is growing faster than GDP growth, it's one of the most important factors for growing the economy. You can see now in the next slide, let's look and see what are some of the characteristics of trade economies as they develop. This is a well-known story, and this just shows something we all say many times and we talk about. This shows you the shift in the manufacturing techniques and the type of services that are exported from three different economies. South Korea, this begins in 1998, and you can see the top line is purple. That represents the amount of electronics that are exported, and the bottom line is turquoise, which is the amount of apparel. You can see that in South Korea, this began in 1988. South Korea was already a manufacturing giant by 1988. You'd have to go back further to see when these lines crossed. If you look at China, Vietnam, this is a very typical pattern of Southeast Asian countries that have gotten into the manufacturing sector. They start with apparel. It's a lower end of the value chain. And then as they get the expertise, as you see the capital come in, as the manufacturing expertise grows, as you have the economy becomes more integrated with the global trade economy, you start seeing the value chain rise as to what the manufacturing involves. And this is where you can see the rise of electronics in China and Vietnam. In the case of China, a very large drop in apparel. There's a couple of countries that look very different than this. India is one that looks very different because India had their exports were services much faster than most other economies. Philippines has a similar curve. If you added on a different curve that looked at value-added outsourcing programs, call centers, knowledge centers, you'd see a different pattern. But this has been a typical pattern throughout Southeast Asia and Asia of the manufacturing boom. And if you went back far enough, you'd see this same type of a curve even with Japan. Now let's look at what are the implications then of the current discussions about trade. There's an expectation that since the tariff discussions rose and then become much more aggressive between the United States in particular, with many countries around the world, discussions of tariffs on oil, on aluminum, on steel, discussions with China, has this slowed down global trade. This chart goes through October 2018, and well, you can see that the rest of the world, trade has continued fairly strong as of the end of 2018. It looks like it might have dropped a little bit in the most recent statistics, but you can see here by this chart that China did drop. Its trade was impacted by this. This is a month-on-month statistics. So you can see that there was a drop. There are some seasonality aspects to this. The holiday season, people buy 3 to 6 months ahead. So a lot of the holiday shopping that would have gone into the supply chain came 3 to 6 months earlier than it actually showed up in the stores in the United States and other markets around the world. But you do see a drop. We're trying to see if this is going to be seasonal. Is this a factor that relates to the tariffs? Or there's another factor in China which is also starting to change some of these types of statistics, and China is becoming a much larger, more important services economy internally. Internal consumption is growing, and it's possible that internal consumption is going to change some of these dynamics of how the Chinese market actually is behaving and is linked to the rest of the global economy. Now, what are some of the implications? What are some of the things that we will talk about in this panel? Obviously, way beyond what's on this slide, but will technology increasingly become local? You have things like 3D printing. You have the ability now to design on demand. You have much more advanced manufacturing and artificial intelligence that can design and print and manufacture in a local scale that maybe is very different than what it has been in the past. And so the technology will change global trade in many ways. But then the question still becomes, can you achieve scale at a local basis? But the supply chains are very linked. So what about local versus global? What can governments do? How much do governments need to get involved in the disruption that will start taking place as manufacturing shifts, as the jobs in manufacturing shift from putting widgets together and putting things together physically to running equipment that runs robotics? The roles in manufacturing are going to shift, and are the governments ready to start having the societal impacts that are implied in their own governmental programs? Next, what about the labor-intensive marketing and economic development? As I started off, I talked about the old labor substitution model, import substitution model. Did that import substitution model ever really work out? It seems as if we move more towards a world of comparative advantages and competitive advantages, and countries are moving towards the area they have the most competitive advantage. But clearly, the most important competitive advantage is labor and labor force and brain power, which probably implies that countries, no matter what the future is, have to invest heavily in education. And then finally, will there be changes in regulation? Will we see changes in the way the world economic order shifts? Are the current discussions about tariffs, steel, aluminum going to lead to new discussions from the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and others around the world? Will Brexit have any kind of an impact on global trade? Obviously, that will have a very immediate impact over the next few months on the situation of the UK directly between Europe. But will there be implications that go beyond that? So I hope that I've been able to give you some thoughts. I end with this slide going back to a picture of yellow, of green and red, and showing how the world is very interconnected. These shift over time. But let me hand it back to Arantxa and thank all of you for listening and hoping that I was able to open up some of the questions we're going to be exploring. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Douglas. So some figures, some facts, and a lot of questions. So what we're going to try to do now is unpack some of these questions. And we're going to start with Minister Bowolo Kenewendo. Minister Kenewendo comes from Botswana. And it's not very clear from the map, Minister, what has been the participation of Botswana and countries like Botswana, landlocked, small economy in size, into the story of global value chains. So what we want to do this morning to start this discussion is look at what value chains look like from a country like Botswana, again, smaller in size, landlocked, where this import substitution never really took off, as we heard from Douglas, but where maybe this new frontier value chains can bring new opportunities. Tell us what these opportunities look like from Botswana.
Well, thank you very much, Arantxa, and thank you very much, Peterson, for this presentation. It's been quite eye-opening, and I'm hoping that the next time you have this presentation, Botswana will be on the red, and we can talk about some growth that has happened. And we've been saying that for us, we're looking at the global value chains and use of technology as a new impetus for small and landlocked economies in order for them to be active participants in global trade, and mainly because in the past we've been told, you know, you're a small landlocked economy, the logistics are against you, the labor issues are against you, so essentially you cannot participate in trade. And what we're seeing with the global value chains is it's changing that narrative for us, and we're seeing a lot of companies coming into Botswana for the components side of manufacturing, and it's allowing us to be, say, the gateway to SADC, if you would, especially for some of this component manufacturing, but also for the last bit of value-added manufacturing, because we have invested heavily, and we're continuing to invest heavily on human capital and on infrastructure. So the roads that are connecting to Zambia, to Zimbabwe, to South Africa, just to enable that positioning of being the gateway and at the heart of the region, because it's not only about the global value chains, it's also about the regional value chains that give new impetus to small and landlocked economies like ourselves. But most importantly as well, as you were talking about localization, I think that we are also seeing some development in new economic growth drivers. So manufacturing has always been quite small, at around 1% of GDP in Botswana, and we are hoping that that will change as we're seeing new companies that are manufacturing bottles. It's again an issue of 3D printing technology that we didn't see before, that didn't allow us to play in the manufacturing space, but things are changing, and we're hoping that that new movement towards GVC, we say new to us because we've been largely left out of trade, but that new movement towards GVCs and technology will see us turning into more of the red the next time we have this discussion. Thank you, Arantxa.
Thank you. Powolo, what, if I may, before you leave us, because I know that you're going to have to leave us soon, but I mean, what would you be looking for? I mean, it's clear that all of this needs some sort of architecture, and that there is a need to have some sort of rules of the game that will help in smoothing the integrations of countries like Botswana into international trade. What are you looking at in terms of governance? Where are you turning? Where are you investing? What part of the rules of international trade you would like sharpened to help the inclusion of smaller economies into international trade?
Yeah, so certainly starting at the regional level, say with our SACU, with our SADC in the region, we should start seeing more planning going towards the development of regional value chains, instead of just having one mega economy that absorbs all manufacturing, but that it starts to spread out in the region. So that should be a deliberate measure when it comes to our RECs. And then going forward into the multilateral space, which I still heavily believe in, and I think it has a strong position to play in ensuring the participation of small and landlocked economies in global trade. So those kind of rules need to be seen as being propped up in the WTO and other multilaterals. And this really takes me back to one of the discussions I had, I think it was in Argentina 2 years ago, where we were talking about that the WTO and the multilateral space needs to remove the bias that is seen or really that is thought to exist and to cater more for other developing small and landlocked economies. But it's also on a more bilateral space. Countries that are looking to diversify their investments outside their own economies need to start looking more at the partnerships that can give them more access to the region instead of where perhaps that's where it has been a traditional engaging market to use. For small and landlocked economies, I would give a recommendation that we also need to do a lot more in terms of investment, not only investment in infrastructure, but in legislative infrastructure as well, and be willing to give the incentives. For example, we just prepared some incentives looking or including like a 5% tax rate in order to lure more companies in manufacturing to come to Botswana, but also to invest more, and I like that you mentioned this earlier, to invest more in human capital. In education, because that is where the world is going, and that's the trend. For us to be able to participate, we should have an educated, skilled manpower that will be able to use these new technologies as they arise.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this very clear sense of direction from Botswana. There really is something that powers these value chains, which is the skills of the individuals and of the people.
Absolutely.
Thanks a lot.
It's a new impetus of growth, so we're quite excited and looking forward to the future.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bhairavi, you run a company, a successful company. It's in the services sector, it's in logistics, but a little bit more. I mean, for a company like you, what are the drivers that you look at when deciding your location? And second question that I have for you is, we are talking a lot about services becoming a more prominent part of international and global value chains. What does that look like from your company's perspective?
I think I'm going to answer your second question first.
Sure.
Because it kind of leads into the first question. Today, if you really look at it, we're looking at trade as goods, and we're measuring more of them as goods. But inherently, it already has a lot of services embedded into it: the marketing, the sales, the supply chain, the logistics. I would say anywhere between 35 to 40%, which is not even getting measured separately. Add to that services like R&D, patents, design, innovation that make it across borders, where manufacturing happens in another country, but designing, patenting, and innovation happens in another country. We're still not measuring that effectively. And then there are all these free digital services that are happening across the world, and there's no way to measure that. I mean, no way to measure how somebody in one country is putting out content on a platform that is being provided by free by another country. So I think there is still no effective measure to measure the effect, the contribution, and therefore the forces that services bring in redefining global value chains. And because of that, we're not really able to move away and see the decision-making that moves away from the labor arbitrage that we've been used to, which is, you relocated supply chain because there was cheap labor. But as manufacturing shifts from low-skill to high-skill labor, the role of services and knowledge-intensive input into manufacturing is going to shift the way you decide where you're going to locate your supply chain, where you're going to locate your value addition. Of course, geopolitics and trade barriers can also change that a bit, but my experience with companies and supply chains is that optimization will win, and companies and private sector will figure out how to work around trade barriers. I mean, we have, for the last 20 years, enjoyed a world where there have been less trade barriers, but supply chains existed before 1990s as well. And companies did figure out how to optimize them. So I don't think we should fear it as much, especially the global order of embedded global supply chains is now irreversible. And I think governments that understand that will do better in preparing their people, And especially in countries like mine, where there are a very large number of young people, we add about 13 million people every year to our work pool to reskill and upskill people. So I think a very big important decision of where you will locate is also going to be based on where you're going to find skilled labor and the kind of skills that you need, or the countries or economies that are going to provide the right condition. But where you're also going to locate is going to be defined by consumption, because that's changing now. It's becoming hyper-local, it's becoming more demand-driven, it's becoming more immediate, and at an accelerated pace. And when that happens, where you are located as a supply chain company becomes very, very important, because fulfillment becomes the driving force and not necessarily just the optimization. So what you considered as a cost center earlier, say customer service, tracking a shipment, is now becoming a value-added service to your business. So that's changing the value addition ladder, as you say, in terms of what you're putting out there. And I think technology, I mean, today you have artificial intelligence, blockchain, they're rising on the horizon, as I would say. But I think they will move very fast. And if companies and countries don't prepare their people accordingly, then you're going to have to deal with the sudden vacuum of jobs or services that move to another country. And therefore, then providers like us would have to move where the skill sets are available, or there is more readiness to deal with that kind of technology. And I think the most important part for us to consider is that today global value chains are not about just big business. E-commerce platforms, aggregators have made it possible for the smallest of players to participate in global chains and to create standards that all these multitude of people who are individual entrepreneurs, I mean, homemakers sell on Amazon now, right? And supply to countries other than, their domestic market. So how are you going to prepare a homemaker who's making some home products, who's supplying to another economy, understand trade and understand barriers and understand global supply chains? Is going to be a real challenge, but I think it's also a massive opportunity for global trade. So I hope that answers your questions.
Thank you. Lots of things to unpack, but the most interesting thing is challenging the figures that we've just seen on the screen as, in a way, not reflecting properly our statistics, not measuring properly the realities of internationalization and fragmentation of our economies. And that's a huge issue that I want to put top of our list to draw some conclusions from this session, because we should be pushing much more aggressively on measuring and measuring properly how much and where is this value being added. June, let me turn to you. You are an observer of these international value chains. You are dissecting them. You are discussing with business. What are you seeing the role of technology and digitalization into the changing shape of businesses?
Yes, thank you. Good morning. I look from the manufacturing angle. If you look at the evolution of manufacturing paradigm, 100 years ago was mass-produced, okay? And gradually the consumer become more selective, and they want to have a personalized product. Now younger generation, younger consumer, they would like to see personalized, not just mass-produced. So the technology actually play a role to help drive this we call personalized product production, we call P3. And really is a consumer, how do you leverage the cost of mass production versus personalized delivery, fulfillment? In this regard, I can see the manufacturing company already pursuing that, the localization of a production site. And the key for the manufacturers, they would like to position their factory to be near the market, to shorten the delivery time, to shorten the logistic cost. So as a driver, at the same time, if you have more and more consumers would like to have a personalized product, how do you lower the cost? So there's a leverage. I think from the manufacturing strategy, people try to delay the differentiation so that you can fulfill the personalized or tailoring near the point of use. So as a result, we have a large hub. They still produce a semi-finished good, then distribute it towards the local market, then do the final mile localization. I think the technology, digital design, digital traceability help to promote that drive. Of course, the geopolitical shift add another dimension to this already happening trend. And people try to avoid the tax, then you have to balance between the cost of moving the production to a lower tariff region or country versus the capability. Sometimes you don't have the talent to support that kind of sophisticated production required. So I think this trend is coming, but I see the technology actually is already helping drive that.
Douglas, how does value added look like in the future?
I think following on these two comments, value added in the future really changes as opposed to somebody managing and organizing the entire supply chain, the entire manufacturing chain. People are going to start being able to pick and choose which part they outsource, which part they do in one country, which part they do in another country. And partly it will be to fulfill the highest quality, fastest service into a specific market so that you can move things around. In fact, we've seen that happening. Put aside the discussions going on right now about tariffs and automotive tariffs, steel and aluminum. If you look at the global supply chain for automotive parts and automotive manufacturing in the last few years, it has started to become very modular. There's companies, Korean and Japanese and German companies that make parts which are in almost every car in the world. They manufacture those parts in Thailand, in Korea, in Japan, in China, in Mexico. The parts from Mexico can end up in a car that's manufactured in China that's exported to another market. You have the parts from a Japanese manufacturing plant end up in a car manufactured in Mexico that ends up in the United States. So we're starting to see this modular approach to the supply chain. And the automotive sector is one where you can see that most specifically. Obviously, politics and tariffs and the role of governments can have an impact on this. One fact I wanted to throw out, I think this might be a good time to do it, just to make the case again for trade. I don't think we have anybody in this room that's against trade, but just to make the case for trade. Last week I was in some meetings with government officials from Mexico where we talked about the rebuilding of NAFTA. And when NAFTA was put in place in the 1990s in the United States, the wildest expectations for the growth of trade for Mexico was about 15% per year. If you go back now and measure what trade has been meant for Mexico, it's not 15% per year, it's 15 times. It's grown. The actual calculation, if you compound it, it's about 12 times. If you don't compound it, it's 15 times. And so this is a great case where you can see where trade has made a massive impact on an economy. The economy has exploded. The trade, but there's a lot of questions in Mexico now about what is our role going to be? Are we going to be assembling? Are we going to be manufacturing? There's also some very complicated rules about rules of origin. So when I buy this suit or these shoes or the pen in my pocket, it says made in someplace. Well, I don't know what that really means, because it could be that the cotton comes from Egypt and the thread comes from Uruguay and the buttons come from China, and it was first assembly was done in Tunisia, but the final sewing was done in Italy, and it says made in Italy. But so the rules of origin is another one of the very complicated political and technical rules that I know is under discussion a lot right now, because as the more modular you get, the more question becomes, where was that product made?
Yeah, in reality, it's made in the world. Made in the world doesn't sell very well, I guess. I want to, at least these days, I want to ask you one short final question before we open the floor to the audience. And this is, seen from where you are, what action is the most urgent in your view? What's the action number one that we should be focusing on? Again, you are going to bring different perspectives because you are in different positions, but let me start with Bhairavi. What is the action number one that you would like to see?
I think the action number one I would like to see is focus on absolute agility and ability to reskill and upskill people at a massive scale. I think that needs redesigning, that needs different focus in, intra-company training at the government level, in the public space, of course, because, for example, by 2030, India will have 1 billion people in the working age group. And imagine in the next decade, you have to keep upskilling and reskilling them constantly. And what is that challenge looking like? Are we prepared for it? How do we deal with it? I think the second action point is that can we really build within industries, within supply chains, open, secure, and trusted data and knowledge sharing practices? Because all the advent of new technology and what we want to do will not be as fruitful if we do not set the standards of privacy, of data sharing, and respecting that knowledge and where it originates from. Third, I think, is embedding really the spirit of including everyone in the process. And I think the rise of nationalism in many of our countries has also alluded and come from the fact that many people feel left out from the globalization that we have experienced till now. They may have not really been left out, but their experience of it is that. And therefore, what can governments do for better communication, better preparedness for small, marginal people, even in society, to participate and benefit from globalization process is going to be imperative. And I think as far as, the world is concerned, we all have to understand that we are all now headed towards limited environmental and natural resources. And therefore, we may have to work more together, collaboratively, to say, well, saving forests in one country is going to help us much more. And therefore, why don't we do this activity in another country? Because that helps, natural resource regeneration in the world. And companies who operate at transnational level can play a significant role in making that happen. Supply chains that are global can really play a very important role in that decision making. So I think those are the few actions that we should be thinking.
Thank you. Very, very rich. Jun,
Yes.
what's your action number one?
Right. I think I'm also for the trade. The action number one, maybe we should continue to improve the global trade standard, the enforcement, like WTO have helped China in the last 20 years to really grow the capability and grow the economy. I think for inclusive development, we need to enforce a global trade or even regional trade. I think the technology is one thing, the digital trade, digital certification, to eliminate the barriers of any trade. The trustworthiness, we talked about, the certification. And there's a lot of technology like blockchain or other type of the digital technology can help to reinforce the global trade.
Thank you. Douglas?
We heard two of the themes which you heard are about education and building skills, and another theme is about the actual framework and parameters of global trade through the WTO. But let me provide a third one, which is infrastructure. Mm-hmm. Infrastructure is a critical theme in almost every country around the world, whether you're starting with developing countries or developed countries. There is a component of it which relates to climate, a more efficient, more effective infrastructure that's rebuilt with better for the long run, with better materials, can actually have a positive environmental impact over time. Infrastructure itself creates jobs just by building it, but there's an opportunity to build infrastructure which is also going to help facilitate the global supply chain. A lot of the infrastructure which is the most efficient in many markets are the ports, especially ports that were built 50, 60, 70 years ago. They haven't been modernized, they're not updated. Airports around the world, I don't know if I've been to any airport recently that was a comfortable experience. and the airport, and I'm just talking about the airports from the services point of view of trade, services, trade, tourism, which is a huge opportunity. That's not in goods, but that's the services part. Building up a tourism trade is an absolutely fabulous opportunity, but you need infrastructure for that. And then you also have the roads, the railroads, the Wi-Fi or the 5G, 4G in countries. So I think that for any country to participate in the global supply chain, and I add to that the global services chain as well, including things like tourism. I think that infrastructure needs to be at the center of the discussion we're having globally. And that leads into finance. And finance is a whole nother topic, and I'm not going to open that one up yet, but there's another whole area in the financial markets we need to look at to support infrastructure, the global supply chain. Small and medium enterprises are probably the hardest place to get financing in every single market in the world is to be a small, medium enterprise. Very easy to get financing if you're a blue chip, and it's actually a lot easier to get financing as an individual than it is as an SME. So that's another area I'd put on the table.
Absolutely right. Now, the floor is now to you. Put your questions. Tell us what's in your mind. Tell us what you agree or disagree with what you've heard so that we can keep the discussion going. If we can get the mic.
Hello, good morning. Michael Sues, my name, Chairman of Oerlikon. I have two, maybe one comment, one question. First, you have shown us on this picture, red and green, the relative change, but you haven't shown the absolute dependence, because I would definitely disagree that countries like Japan or Germany are not depending on trade. If you're export champion and you're not depending on trade, I would question how can that be. So we should not look only this relative performance, but as well the absolute one. Yeah. And then take in consideration that with digitalization and with additive manufacturing, which we touch this year a little more in depth on Davos, will be a totally game changer in manufacturing. And that will localize by far more. So the old traditional business model probably is, from my country, Germany, will die, not completely, but over time, that you have some countries where you produce and then to send it around the world. Because in the end, you send the specification and you print it where you need it. So it will have significant impact on logistics. It will have significant impact on where you produce and where you manufacture. And then someone of you has mentioned that at the beginning, the brain skill will be I would say will be the decisive point who will be successful and not. Because the low labor cost or the dumping on social cost or environmental situation, I think most countries cannot afford it anymore. China paid a huge price for this rapid ramp up of their society on industry, on their economic side, on the ecological side. So nobody can afford that anymore. So I would love to touch that a little deeper, that with digitalization, additive, you have significant changes, and the brain skill and how to bring that abroad will change our complete setup.
Thank you. Shall we take a few, and then we'll ask the panelists to go into these questions?
I agree with the comment, a very good comment.
Yeah.
The gentleman over there.
Hi. A number of you discussed the need for reskilling, which of labor, which at the highest level makes perfect sense. That being said, if we all believe that, let's say, the U.S. economy will invest $8 trillion in automation, it may be a complete substitution of labor. So when you say reskilling, what are you imagining will be the role of labor in a world of bots, cobots, and robots?
Excellent. And there was a question here.
Hi, I'm Neely Gilbert from Mataran Capital. My question is about supply chain traceability. Among consumers and investors, there's a rising demand to understand in a deep way all of the parts of the supply chain that a company products are delivering. And it's difficult to trace. I was wondering if you could share with us some trends there. There are questions both around risk forecasting as well as around sustainability from an environmental and social perspective. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dinesh Khara from State Bank of India, India. Well, when it comes to the finance for the global supply chain, the most credible factor happens to be the trust of the transactions which happens between various parts of the ecosystem in the supply chain. Very often, the disruptions which are seen on account of the trade disruptions, actually it shakes the confidence of the lenders. I think there is an increasing need for according the credibility to the trade deals. And of course, fully agree with the panel's view that it happens to be a very essential component for any of the manufacturing unit to be a part of the trade ecosystem across the globe. And the customization piece which was talked about is very interesting, and actually it holds good for the services as well, not only for manufacturing, for services as well. I think in the services sector also, there are a lot many semi-finished products which are created and then customized according to the requirements. Mm-hmm. But for a lender to know that what is the exact component of what has gone in and what needs to be financed, there is a big question mark in the mind of a lender, because lender is obviously not very sure about the various components of the services and the trade. So some credible measures will certainly enhance the flow of trade of finance to support such activities.
Thank you. So the question goes back to trust and building trust in this new system of value chains. Anybody else? Gentleman at the back.
Nicola Dabberstein, Ethikoni. One of the next frontiers of global supply chain must be digitization. And digitization is easier said than done because it requires integration of different regulations, ecosystems, infrastructure, very different interests by parties involved in the supply chain, like customs. And so it would be good to get your perspective of how do you believe, what one can do to really push this forward.
Thank you. Let me turn to the panel. Let me start with Douglas. We've heard questions around, the radical shift in value chains with this drive to localize, thanks to technology. We've heard a second question around skills and the role of labor. And on that one, I would recommend that you read the upcoming report that I think the ILO, International Labour Organization, is releasing today on the future of work, because that is an essential piece in this discussion that we should not forget. Third question around traceability. Fourth question around financing. Fifth question around governance of this mega transformation. Douglas.
Let me start by just digging a little bit deeper under the numbers. We had a comment here about that these numbers are very simplistic. This is just a single calculation that shows the change in ratio of trade versus GDP. But to do a second order analysis, you need to look at what type of manufacturing it is. Is it crushing soybeans to extract oil and soy meal? That's considered to be manufacturing, but that's a very low-end type of manufacturing. Or is it creating an automobile that has very advanced analytics in it, and actually the entire dashboard of the car is filled with computer chips that have memory and are providing you a whole new experience inside of the cockpit of a car. So this slide is very simplistic and doesn't give you the subtlety of the different type of manufacturing. One of the other themes that's kind of embedded in a little bit in the discussions of all the points we made is also demographics. There's a very different societal and economic need in advanced economies with aging populations, with Japan being the most at the furthest end of an aging population, without not even having a level of replacement with its birth rate of the death rate versus birth rate. So you see an inverted pyramid in the Japanese structure, which means that they have to think about automation, and there's many things that the Japanese economy is facing that are almost forcing them into higher level analytics and rethinking the role of the workforce. How do you robotize and automate many more things, versus an economy that still has a very large demographic dividend and a large young population which is moving into the workforce. So the implications country by country are very different, economies, society to society, but every single one of them, no matter where you are in the demographic chain, no matter where you are in the value chain, is going to have to confront these issues because the world is changing. It's changing right in front of us. Miniaturization, robotics, the ability to have information data analytics, what we talked before about customization, the actual infrastructure, the governance of global trade, all of these are going to impact our decisions as to where we're going to manufacture and how we're going to manufacture. And I think of the comments we've had here on the panel in these discussions, I do think we need to shake out the governance structure. You know, having a weak or a shaky WTO or any kind of lack of confidence in the WTO, having an uncertain situation with Brexit, having an uncertain situation with the US's policies towards tariffs and towards its relationship with China, those create uncertainty that are not healthy for global trade.
Bhairavi?
Well, I think I'm going to sound a bit cliched, but this all boils down to leadership. Leadership in the individual companies, to answer your questions about reskilling. You have to really see where the trend is going and start preparing your people even before the change is going to hit. Because the change may hit very fast. So it's rising on the horizon, but it may suddenly be midday. And you know, you're in the spotlight. And you don't want to do that to people who work with you. And the same applies for the governments as well. I think what we all have to prepare for is many decades of adult education completely transforming. The idea of learning, the idea of education will completely change. And how we interact with knowledge and data will completely change. And therefore, we have to be open to that. And you know, from an infrastructure perspective, governance and policy perspective, we have to be prepared for that. To answer the question on traceability, I think today you have significant traceability of finished goods. What you're really asking for is, you know, so what happened to this jacket? I mean, where was it before that? Was it picked by people who were, you know, laborers, but in, you know, not paid, you know, fair wages? And I think that kind of process is going to be pretty much possible with blockchain technology. If you look at diamond supply chain, for example, today, you can track from which mine the diamond came all the way down to, you know, how many hands it changed. And so it's already possible in one user case. And I'm sure as supply chains adapt more and more to the blockchain process, you will have more and more traceability as a consumer. And that's going to change a lot of consumer decision making, and that will change consumption patterns for sure. So to answer that question, I think we had a question on governance standards. And I think there are already governments and international organizations like the World Customs Organization and others who are trying to work with individual countries to see if we can agree on some basic standards. But it again boils down to, are we ready for all of us who are leading or in one way in a leadership role, wherever we are we willing to take leadership and lead and you know, start thinking about the future and start planning for the future? Unless everybody does their leadership bit, this is going to be difficult. And inherent in all of this is an understanding and acceptance that we have to work together. There's nobody first and second. You know, everybody is equal, whether they're small landlocked countries, or they're big countries, or they're small island countries that are facing bigger climate changes, or they're countries with older population, with younger population, more consuming, more producing. Really doesn't matter. We have to work together. And I think everything from climate change, technology, the new way of work is forcing us to take leadership on rethinking on how we work together as a global community. So that's what I would like to say.
Thank you, Bhairavi. John?
Yes, I'd like to also add to the point to be a global player in the global value chain, either a company or a country, you have to have those discussed, the education, the infrastructure, the leadership. But I will summarize into a capability. If you don't upgrade your capability, it's not just operate or replaced by a robot. You have to be able to react, interact with the OEM, to the market, to the consumer. I think the capability is a key. Capability including all the infrastructure, education, talent, energy supply, logistics. But I think that there's another side of it, is a business model. Maybe there's a new business model we have to think, collectively, globally. Today, the store and factory are separated. I envision in the near future, actually something already happened. Store is part of the factory. I'll call a secretary. For example, in the United States, the Home Depot, it's basically provide a lot of building materials, parts, and components. Today, the do-it-yourself people buy those components, go to your own home, do the final tailoring, cutting. But today, with the digital technology, you can envision every Home Depot will have a corner. The people will do your own design, customize to your own preference, then boom, it's a smart warehouse. Or the supply, you have your own personalized product. And that model is coming. It's changing the global value chain, and it's changing the supply chain as well.
Can I add one thing about materials? This is just a quick anecdote. At the World Economic Forum 2 years ago, I met with some entrepreneurs, and one of the entrepreneurs had a thimble. It was about this big, full of millions of particles, and each particle was, they were a unique identifier that you could put in an entire tank of oil, and when it gets mixed in an entire tank of oil, that little tiny particle is an individual, unique identifier, and you can see where that oil goes around the world. And so this idea about traceability, there's a lot of interesting things going on, not only blockchain, but also materials that that you can only read in with a certain type of a technique, so it no longer becomes easy to counterfeit materials. And so there's a lot of interesting things going on in that space.
I mean, on this, since we are a bit of a commercial, we in the International Trade Center have been working a lot on traceability of supply chains. And there is even a website you can access. It's called sustainabilitymap.org. What we have done is work with companies to trace their supply chains. Granted, we've started with the agriculture, agro-processing value chains, probably because this is the simpler to trace. But my sense, when I look at big trends out there, is that consumers will drive a lot of the trends of manufacturing in the future. It's consumers that are asking and that are pushing to know what is it that they are buying, where is it that has been produced, what kind of norms has the product respected. So producers that are smart are starting to embed this dimension into their manufacturing, because that is how they will satisfy what consumers are demanding, which is more information, more knowledge. Then we can have a discussion about how this information and knowledge is shared and how much is it out there and how much is helping or confusing the consumer. But for sure, consumption, and I don't know who mentioned it, I think you mentioned it, Bhairavi, is a big driver for manufacturing in the future. Good. Second thing I wanted to tell you is that with a different hat, the hat of co-chair of the Future Council on Trade and Investment of the World Economic Forum, together with Penny, who's sitting at the back of the room, we are going to be putting this trade community to talk a little bit more with the manufacturing community. Because one of the big problems we face, and you said that, is that manufacturing is moving in one direction, but the governance of a lot of the underpinnings of this manufacturing, from the use of data to the analytics and the barriers that manufacturing faces today, these two worlds are not connected. So we're going to put these two communities to do a bit of work under the World Economic Forum and the International Trade Center with the Future Council on Trade and Investment to look at how we bring these two communities together. Thank you very much. This was an interesting discussion. Frankly, I have a longer list of questions that I had when coming into the room, and which I think is a fair description of the situation. I think we have heard 4 big themes that we need to dig deeper into. One is measuring. We are not measuring today. If I just look at comparing trade with GDP, GDP is value-added, trade is flows. Already that is a bit of a problem in my mind. Second thing we've heard, and which is of huge importance for value chains, is the skilling. Third is architecture, governance issues. And fourth is rethinking the architecture, or rethinking the infrastructure that will underpin the work of value chains, including the financial architecture. Thank you very much for your participation, and hope to have entice you to keep engaged into the conversation on how we shape the value chains of the future. Thanks a lot, and thank you to the panelists.
Thank you.